O'Siodhachain, what do you think is the relevance of a festival in Ennistymon to commemorate Dylan Thomas or Kathleen McNamara?
Very much so, with the emphasis on the latter, because while Dylan Thomas now, his work is recognised worldwide, and there are very few places in the Western academic world today where at some stage or the other in the run of the year there are festivals, there are talks, there are seminars to do with Dylan Thomas. But it's my own personal opinion in this, that the role of Kathleen is very much undervalued and indeed forgotten. And the relevance of this is this was not long Kathleen's hometown. This was Kathleen's home house. Of course it influenced her and everything to do with it and her family background. She in turn influenced Dylan, so you have one stream feeding into it there. The second stream you're feeding into it, and I'm glad to see it was touched here and there during the talk so far, and I will be dealing with it in greater detail myself. During the early part of their life, when they had a good relationship and they still chimed and they were on the same wavelength, the support that Kathleen gave Dylan, the domestic support, she made it possible for him to sit down and write in an organised, systematic manner. And her daughter, in her own talks about her mother, describes Dylan coming back from his house on the cliff, where he was shut away from it all with a lot of work for the morning, reading through, Kathleen interrupting her domestic responsibilities, having a look at what he'd done, a flick through it, reading some of it, and at a certain point she'd say, all right, enough. She was satisfied with the quality. He had produced another morning's work. He could go on then, ramble into town, have his few beers, a pint or what have you, had his morning's work behind him. But Kathleen at that stage kept a home base and kept a stability that in light of Dylan's later years, it was so very necessary for it. And all of that started here. And of course, we have the Literally Festival going back here and the Literally connections, and I'll be touching on these briefly inside, going back to Brian Merriman. So there's every reason for having a festival here, and the quality of this festival so far can hold its own with other festivals that have been 3, 4, 5 years on the go. There's been quality stuff here, and I think it will be credit to Ennistymon, and it will put North Clare on the Literally map. Opening here with Andrew last night, the roadmap he gave through Dylan's life, the milestones he erected at each stage of the way, the thoroughness, the sheer thoroughness and research with which he covered it, such as a lot of scholars aren't familiar with the Blasket period and the Blasket writers, and how interested in that whole genre of writing Dylan was, and how much he wanted to get into it and never got around to do it. So we had a fine start to the festival. The last speaker here, I needn't go into that. The technical details of what he've done and the importance of it speak for itself, and I think everybody here appreciated it. And everything in between has been top drawer quality. And for a festival that's just getting to its feet, that this is the first run, I think you'll all agree with me that the quality of this festival so far over this weekend would do credit to a festival that's 4 or 5 years down the road and well established. And there's great credit due to Fred Johnson here, to the Western writers, to Barbara, and everybody associated with the festival for what's been achieved so far. The other thing I'd like to say is in relation to this festival, and it's an appeal to the women here in particular, to the female members for future years. This festival is in Kathleen's home place. It very much influenced her. We are in her family home. We are in her town. I know at the latter end of their relationship, things were, as they say in Kerry, a bit on the rough side. But at the early stages of the relationship, when they chimed, when they were together, the help and the support that Kathleen gave Dylan was immeasurable and incalculable. There is widespread appreciation of Dylan throughout the Western world at this point in time in the academic world. And there are very few universities in the Western world that somewhere or the other in the run of the year or every 2 years will not have seminars or talks or something to do with Dylan. He's captured the romantic imagination. But Kathleen's part in this is very much ignored in latter years. And only serious scholars of Dylan's work appreciate what it meant to the stability and the discipline that when he was able to go out in that cliff, write for 3 or 4 hours in the morning, come back, she had the kids out from under his legs, he had a separate place to do it, his meals were there waiting for him, he was able to have a meal and then go away and have his few beers after his morning's working, came back and no doubt he wasn't doing his own laundry either or what have you. And we've only to look at later Dylan, when he was out from under Kathleen's influence in London and elsewhere, how much his productive life disintegrated. And I think it's when measured against that, Dylan's life post-Kathleen as he started to move away from her, and Dylan's life with Kathleen, that shows the influence, the stability and the help she was to him. And I would like to see in future years more emphasis in that, and Kathleen restored to the centrality of where she was in the Dylan Thomas saga. That's just my own view on it, and I would appeal to the women contributors here in particular to see that that's done. The previous speaker removed quite a bit of my lecture, because the one area I was weakening in this and to go in was the part that Wales and the Welsh influence played on Dylan Thomas. That has been very, very effectively covered here, and I wouldn't even attempt to go down that road or touch that again. But what I want to do here is show and go back over Celtic themes and how Celtic themes migrated into the English language and how these Celtic themes became so commonplace within the English language that they passed almost beneath the level of awareness and they were taken for granted. We have Scotland in the north, we have Ireland to the west, we have the Isle of Man in the middle, and what we often forget is the influence of Cornwall and the sheer Celticity of Cornwall and the Celtic ethos of Cornwall up to quite late in the 16th, 17th and 18th century. And indeed, a lot in Cornwall would argue that it's still there and very, very strong, even if the language has changed, that the ethos is there, and to use a Gaelic term, that the Schliagana, the way of mind, the way of thinking is there. And I've met a lot of Cornish people at Pan-Celtic to agree with that statement and not to dispute it. And of course then the influence of Wales itself. But sticking with the Celtic thing for the moment, mainstream English, we often forget. English is a universal language today. It's in the Americas. It's the vernacular of a lot of Europe. It's Australia, New Zealand. It's mainly the language of the world of commerce. And yet, it's a language that only came into its own in 12 generations. And as late as 9 generations ago, the great Gaelic poet, Daithí Ó Brúdar, was so dismissive of the English language as a culture carrier, as a mode of refined, sophisticated expression that used his own colourful nomenclature. He dismissed it as a language of barter, a language but fit to sell pigs in. And yet this is at the same time he was dismissing this, the language of Shakespeare was percolating through. There were all new concepts coming into the English language. It was being enriched. It had absorbed the Anglo-Saxon legacy. It had absorbed the French legacy, which isn't often acknowledged. And again, if we go back the 12 generations behind the fall of the flight of the Earls and the Elizabethan plantation, England was a very minority language here in Ireland. It was the language of the Pale. It was the language of a few towns dotted around the coast. And the England main language and the cultural language was Gaelic and French. And of course, the international language of the day, Latin. And going back behind that for another 30 generations and more, the language, of course, was Gaelic. You had the same in Scotland. And the first indication and the falls down of the richness of the Irish language and what was there occurred, of course, in the Macpherson saga, when a character, Macpherson, took fragments of Fianna legends from Munster, from my own part of the country, here in Saltangry, and tried to claim them for Northern Scotland, and filled in the missing pieces himself. Irish scholarship at that time was mainly in exile in the continent. We were under the penal laws here, and there were few great Irish houses that had scholarship and that had the intellectual capacity to oppose what was being done and expose it. Charles O'Connor was one such person, descended from the O'Connor Connachts, from the O'Connors of Connacht and the old royal family there. And of course, the other person that came to the fore and probably played a more dogged role in exposing what was happening was Sylvester O'Halloran here in Limerick. And you can really trace the Irish cultural renaissance and the appreciation of the old Gaelic culture percolating through into the common English culture in the defence of Sylvester O'Halloran and of O'Connor. That appreciation started, it built up from there, and of course then you have people like Bishop Graves in Limerick and people like that coming to the fore, and you have the Royal Commissions in the 19th century. But this was the start of it in the 1700s. Macpherson was exposed, but as Macpherson was on the wane and he was exposed as a charlatan, Sir Walter Scott came into his own. And what Walter Scott did in the Lays of the Last Minstrel was he captured the rhythms, the speech patterns, the poetry and the ethos of Gaelic culture and of Lowland Scots culture, and he brought that into mainstream. I've had the privilege some years ago of joining the Saunier Society. I spend a bit of time in Newbattle Abbey every year. The old Scottish family that owned the fine abbey there and the library in that abbey left their library behind for the use of the adult college. And as Scots books were published, they became part of the library. They're available there, and I was able to do a lot of original research from books that were published around the period. And one of the first things I discovered about Scott was, far from being raised in Edinburgh, he was sent out to an aunt out in the countryside, brought up by her, and there's a very irate account by a person who was attempting to court his aunt and had his evening's activities constantly interrupted by a 4-year-old Scot running from room to room, declaiming poetry at the top of his voice and listening to the feedback and trying it out in room after room. And let's say it wasn't conducive to courtship. And in the person concerned expressing his annoyance at Scott, we have the first picture of a young poet, and I would have been in the same position in the Corkery border where I grew up in the Age of the Horse with old people that taught me the poetry and taught me to say it aloud and taught me to declaim it, and the same thing, listening to the sound and listening to the feedback, and I would have been doing it aloud going the road, because my primary grounding in poetry is a performed art, one of the 5 traditional performed arts, the other 4 of course being poetry was the primary one. Then came music, song, storytelling and dancing. They were the 5 traditional performed arts. And in other parts of the country, such as Armagh and Wexford, mummery is part of it as well. They came in with the Normans, and it's regarded as a performed art. So after Macpherson, when we're looking for patterns within it, where the previous speaker was looking at word patterns and vowel sounds, what I'm looking at here primarily, I'm dealing with a broad brush stroke, so I'm dealing with rhythms and where these rhythms come in. And as we're in Merriman's country, I can start with this one that'll be familiar to all of you. Begann me shul le cús na hán an báisteach úras an drúg go trám. In nacken na gailte taobh na sléite, gan marat gan mail, shriilte an lé. The galach an crín or a keen loch graine, on talamh an tír risir na spére. You have that da rhythm running through it. I'll be returning to Lochinvar in more detail later. This is Walter Scott's Lochinvar. The bold Lochinvar has come out of the west, through all that while border his deed was the best. And safe his good broadsword of arms said none, he rode all unarmed and he rode alone. So faithful in love and so dauntless in war, was there ever a knight like the young Lochinvar. It's obvious at once that the rhythm that Brian Merriman is using here, and in the Gaelic language, and this is important with Merriman because Merriman's poem in defence of women was, as I wrote elsewhere, the last great cry from Gaelic Ireland for the robustness of the Gael against the dry-tested inheritance of the Pauline tradition. And what a cry it was. So with Walter Scott in this, I look at 3 themes in particular from within the Gaelic poetry that worked their way into the English language. Celtic society was a warrior society. So the first was the deed of Goshke, the deed of valour. The second was the romantic theme. And the third was the other world. And the great poem of Scott that combines something of all 3 of that and is tied up with the current day Roslin Chapel, Roslin Castle, Da Vinci Court territory and all the rest, from the Lay of the Last Minstrel, is the poem of Rosabelle. And Rosabelle was one of the poems I learned in my teenage years and did it, and was doing it continually since. So to give you a sense of what's involved here and the difference between the read word and the spoken word. If I were to read the poem of Rosabelle to you, it would go something like this. Listen, listen, ladies gay, no haughty feet of arms I tell. Sad is the note and soft the lay that mourns the lovely Rosabelle. More the bark, ye gallant crew, and lovely lady designed to stay. Rest thee in castle Ravensue, nor tempt the stormy firth the stay. Right, I want him to microphone. Listen, listen, ladies gay, no haughty feat of arms I tell. Soft is the note and sad the lay that mourns the lovely Rosabelle. More the barky gallant crew, and lovely lady designed to stay. Rest thee at Castle Ravensue, nor tempt the stormy firth to stay. The blackening waves are edged with white, for inch and rock the seamews fly. The fishers have heard the water sprites who screams for Borrick is nigh. Last night the gifted seer did view a wet shroud wrapped round Lady Gay. Then stay thee fair at Raven Sue, why tempt the stormy firth to stay? 'Tis not because Lord Lindsay's son tonight at Roslin leads the ball, but because my sainted mother there sits lonely in her castle hall. 'Tis not because the ring they ride, and Lindsay at the ring rides well, but because my sire his wine would chide, unless 'tis poured by Rosabelle. In Roslin all that dreadful night a wondrous light was seen to gleam. 'Twas wider than the watchfires bright, 'twas brighter than the pale moon gleam. It glared on Roslin's castle rock, and readied all the redwood glen. 'Twas seen from Dryden's oaken groves, and from Cavern to Thornden. Seemed all on fire that chapel proud, where Roslin's chiefs and coffin lie, each baron for a sable shroud, sheeted in his iron panoply. Seemed all on fire within a round deep sacristy and altar pale. Gleamed every pillar foliage bound, and it glimmered all the dead men's mail. Gleamed battlement and pemmet high, gleamed every rose-carved buttress there, as still they gleam when fates are nigh, the lordly lines of high St. Clare. 20 of Roslin's barons bold are buried beneath that proud chapel, each one the sacred grave doth hold. But the seas holds the lovely Rosabelle, and each St. Clare was buried there, with candle, with buck, and with knell. But the sea caves rung, and the wild waves sung the dirge of the lovely Rosabelle. That now is how a Gaelic rectory or reciter would perform that same poem. If we take then the rhythm that I gave there for Lochinvar, I want to go from the end of the 1700s and from Walter Scott and that Lochinvar poem, and just cite the end of that one, where the theme he used in this is in Lochinvar. Lochinvar's lover and the woman he fancy. Lochinvar obviously is a knight of poor means. Safe his good broadsword of arms had none. And at that time of night would have an entourage going around with him. He'd have a squire, he'd have a page, he'd have a spare horse, he'd have somebody to take his armour. This guy had a bare minimum to class as a knight, so not surprisingly, his parents parents of his proposed lover were about to marry her off to a man of considerable means, who Walter Scott's describe as a laggart in love and a dastard in war, was to wed the fair Ellen of young Lochinvar. Edward Welch was born early in the 18th century. He was from Slieve Lucre. He was in the same position now, as very much the same position as Dylan Thomas in one way, in that his mother made sure he was fluent in English, but he was equally fluent in Irish and conversant in both languages. He became a school teacher in Waterford. He wrote a pamphlet, What is Papa, What is Repeal? And described what the repeal was about and why it should be. He came to the notice of the authorities. He was sacked by the landlord, and he was taken to Dublin by the founder of the Nation newspaper. He wrote there for a time, and he brought that mainstream poetry from the hills of Slieve into the heart of Dublin. And of course, he started to look at how this was successfully done. And for the Lochinvar poem, he transposes that to Newmarket, to Chief of Clancauley, where with Lochinvar, if you remember in that great poem, he comes to the hall all alone, where the wedding feast is in full progress. He says he is no longer, he pretends that he's offended because the suit is denied. He just asked to drink a measure to the bride, to have one dance with her, and that's it. There's plenty more women interested in him that he can marry. So he drinks this cup of wine, then he has a dance with her, but he dances her to the door, shoots through the door, tosses her in the hearse, and he's away into the sunset. And that finish up, so faithful in love, and so valiant in war, was there ever a knight like the young Lochinvar. And here we have the last three verses of the great poem from Newmarket, where the young woman is abducted and held in the fairy fort against her will. On a sound, the chief of MacAuliffe going to the underground kingdom. The same thing, he feigns disinterest in Ellen. He don't, of course, drink or eat fairy food, but he demands a dance with her, dance with a measure. He dances with her, and he's timed everything just right, and he dances her through the door at daybreak, and just as they get through the portal, the cock crows, and the fairy mansions vanish, and he's brought her back into the mortal thing. And not alone is Welsh deliberately copying and basing his own lay on Sir Walter Scott's work, but he even uses some of his words, and he uses the same title. It's actually paying of homage to Walter Scott, as well as transposing something from Gaelic culture into modern English culture. So because of time constraints, I'll just read you the last three of it. He bowed to young Ellen, she blushed and looked down. Some beauties grow pale and some maidens did frown. Such graceful young dancers 'twas seldom to see. His stature so noble, so beauteous was she. High heavens defend us, he whispered and said, there's danger, dear maid, in this measure we tread. And quick gleamed their steps on the diamond paved floor. One hand grasped the lady, they rushed to the door. And one the black dagger, whose spell-rending steel the power of the fairy would tremble to feel. Then cast his fond maid in his ardent embrace, and gaining the portal, escaped from the place. There were rushing of lady and chiefs of the hall, and wailing and woe the bravest appall. But the coxswain clarion gave notice of day, and the hall of the fairy guests faded away. So constant in love, and danger so bold, have ye heard of a chief like the Lord of the Wold? I suggest ye have, and his name is Lochinvar. So there's the tie-up between the Scottish and Gaelic culture. It shows how when Sir Walter Scott took these great themes, brought them into mainstream English language, that just one step behind him, as the penal laws eased, education became available for the Catholics, that already you have a new generation like Edward Welch taking up these same things. And these are being brought into mainstream English. These are being brought into mainstream English across the way. Now, where it differs, probably from Dylan Thomas, is in the Irish and Scottish, and where I've been down that road, you can't really compare directly, not in the way the previous speaker have done, and analytically the way the previous speaker have done, with Dylan Thomas and his relationship to Wales. Because to use a contradiction in terms maybe, in English Scotch and in English Irish, the patterns are there, the rhythms of the language are there, the methodology is there, the Schliagen is there. But it's this whole genre, this whole ethos, these themes, by the famine era in Ireland and by the 1850s, even earlier, I would say, these have become such a part of mainstream English that they are no longer regarded as remarkable. And we are back full circle here then with Dylan Thomas. Because when Dylan Thomas's father was teaching English and teaching mainstream English, these themes and these things had already been transposed into mainstream English and almost passing beneath the level of awareness in mainstream English. On the other hand, there was a very conscious awareness of these things, because politicians are never too far behind public sentiment and popular sentiment, especially when it's to their advantage. So as you know, the English royal family, after the unpopularity of the Hanoverians, took a very Scottish romantic Highland turn, got a place in Balmoral, spent their summer holidays up there, flouted their Scottishness, went around in kilts, all the rest of that. And some would say that Queen Victoria got into Scots in a big way, and others would say Scots got into Queen Victoria, but I won't go down that road. What you do have is, on the one hand, you have this underground thing from Walter Scott and this great romantic movement copied in Ireland, as I've shown, and you have that reflected in Wales, and there was a mention here made of snow, and if I was going to do a poem as an example in Wales, I have a poem there from medieval in my Celtic collection. I have a poem from medieval Wales to do with snow, and there's about 30 lines in it, and it's as graphic as anything you get in the Eskimo language, describing snow and the character of snow and what snow do to the countryside, and I would have been using that as an illustration. But to stick with what's here at the moment, in Cornwall and in Scottish societies and in Celtic societies in the United States, you have these works of Sir Walter Scott, and later the works of the Young Ireland movement and people like that in the second half of the 19th century. They are feeding into mainstream culture, and they have become such a part of mainstream culture that when the next generation then, like W.B. Yeats, come along of the Anglo-Irish, and some genres not as literally as W.B. Yeats, for instance, the Somerville Sisters and the Irish Orim, that what they have done there is absolutely magical, because they've captured, they are observing, they are both part of the culture and they are part from it. They are both observer and participant. They are like Lady Gregory in that regard. And again, as a Republican, I've been saying this all my life, that while there are many aspects of Anglo-Irish culture that one could condemn, it's remembered nowadays for the land wars, but there was also some very positive sides to that culture. And when Yeats said in regard to Lady Gregory that when the day would come that the house wouldn't have a stone upon a stone, there still should be praise and blessing on her laurelled head. And I will do one of my own poems in that regard before going, because it's appropriate for the house here I'm in tonight to do it. So for all these reasons, that this is there, it's after working in, and it's already laid as a foundation. So Yeats and the next generation then of Anglo-Irish, Yeats is really what he said himself, he's doing no more than an old song resung. The foundations are there, the themes are there. It's after translating so seamless into mainstream English that it's no longer remarkable, even in London and in literary circles in London. And if anything, it's over-embraced in London because it's romanticised. And once you get a culture appearing in biscuit tins to sell biscuits and things like that, the danger signals are already there, and you're back to Dylan Thomas then, and using Dylan Thomas to sell various beers. But in Brian Merriman, I started with him, and I'll come back to that again. But gona me shul le kius na home. There was an ad in television for Stag beer. And there was something about that ad that appealed to young males and turned them on. And I was often amused to see it inside in a pub. And what you had was actually the rut of a stag there, the sexual act of a stag, and it was deliberately, and this is the pulse that's running through Celtic poetry and things like Merriman. It was very deliberately done. Well, maybe not so much as a rotting stag, to use a phrase from my own part of the country, like a couple going at it hammer and tongues against a cock of hay on a summer's evening. And it's that pulse, the pulse beat of creation, the very pulse beat of life itself, the pulse beat of procreation, that's running in that. And even that slips into the English language. Beneath in puritanical Victorian society, beneath the level it subverts, and it's in there, and it's being used without people aware of what they're being used. So what I'm suggesting here is that while Dylan Thomas, like my friend McCartnett, was dreaming in Irish, writing in English, that he was also dreaming in Welsh and writing in English. But the English that he was writing was already had already an underlay and a transposition of Celtic themes, Celtic languages brought in, that was becoming part of the everyday vernacular and had slipped into the everyday vernacular beneath the level of awareness. And in reading Dylan Thomas's work, I can see these patterns resonating with Celtic poetry, with Irish poetry, with Scottish poetry, there beneath the level of awareness. I won't go so far as to say that Dylan sat down line by line and examined these things, because, as I've said, time and time again myself, I've had people come up to me after a poetry performance especially and start pointing out technical aspects and congratulating me in it. And I just, Jesus, that's news to me, I must write that down. And it's something completely natural from the way I was inculcated into poetry, and the way poetry was taught to me, and the way my own poetry expanded and flowed from there, that inside my culture, the poetry and the music is one, and it would be as ridiculous for me in Slieve Lucre to stand up before a crowd and read from a poem as I would for a singer to stand up, as for a traditional song, to pull out a sheet and start singing with it. I once had a well-known poet in Dunconnell's in Knocknagree, and he was asked to do a few poems, and he did. He pulled out a book and he read 3 or 4 poems. And I was told in no uncertain terms the next time I was back there on my own that if they wanted somebody to read the Examiner, they had better readers than him. That it was dismissed like that. So there's a rich theme there, and again for this festival as a pointer for coming years, I would like to see these themes as we're exploring Kathleen's contribution and what she did and what she had to observe, and Kathleen's Irishness, the same as the Somervilles, in the Anglo-Irish context. Because this is another thing, as an Irish Republican, I am very, very annoyed about. Nationalist Catholic Ireland appropriated the young Irelanders into their culture and claim those young Irelanders for their culture. And yet, Tone, Russell, the United Irishmen, Thomas Davis, the Young Irelanders, it was their very Protestantism that informed their value system, and it's arising out of that value system they then gave expression to politics, and it informed their politics. And we have committed a grievous wrong against that Ireland, because in appropriating that culture, we've also left that culture without their own culture heroes, and we have left sectarian orange bands take over where there is decent mainstream Protestant culture heroes there that should be rehabilitated. The rehabilitation is on a macro level, like what needs to be done with the Young Irelanders, but it's also on a micro level and completely manageable in festivals like this to restore, take Kathleen, the culture of her childhood, what it was about, to explore that, and then to show how that worked through into mainstream culture. And I think it would be very easy indeed to transpose that and see how it influenced Dylan in those years, and how they interrelated, and how they interfaced, and how it interacted. So I haven't followed an analytical way here of doing this with you. What I've done it is from a position of synthesis. I've laid down certain things, almost like setting down pieces of a picture puzzle. You assemble that for yourself, and you assemble it in the context of the other fine lectures you see here tonight, and how it all fits together. And I pose the question, did Dylan originate something completely new here, a new language or a new way of expression, or again, was he singing an old song resung? I don't propose to answer that question, even though I posed it. I leave you answer that for yourselves in the context of this weekend. I'll finish with this poem in honour of Lady Gregory, and concerning a visit up there, as we are in the house of the McMahons, and a house that was a house of the Anglo-Irish, in praise of those, and in praise of Lady Gregory and everything she did for the Irish cultural revival movement. In Nut Wood, while breezes sang through ancient ash and sycamore, as you and I met lip and eye to do what lovers did before, arm twined down woodland paths to settle in the low stone seat, where pride and passion, proud and pen, gave olden words a new heartbeat, and send them winging world-wide to be forever centre stage, the shimmering conscience of a race that scribed their line on history's page. Now in mind's eye all trooping by, her star-topped throng though long since dead, last kiss for her that forged them here, and a prayer and blessing on her laurel head. Rwyf Milamodi.